Hi everyone, and welcome to our presentation. This is Dr. James Corcoran from Renison University College at the University of Waterloo. Our presentation today is going to be tackling the topic of digital autobiographical identity texts and the potential of using this particular pedagogy in the language teacher education classroom, as well as in K-12 classrooms. And our multi-ethnography that we'll be describing to you today is a set of conversations between myself and three of my former language teacher candidates who at the time were taking a master's level course at OISE, the education faculty at the University of Toronto. So first of all, we'd like to thank all the folks at Searle at the University of Arizona for making this, giving us the platform to share our work today. So we hope you enjoy our presentation, and on we go. So this is a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. We'll talk about the rationale for engaging in this work. We'll go over some of the shared and differing positionalities of the four of us as researchers and teacher researchers. We'll talk about our conceptual lens that we use to approach this work. We'll go over what exactly a multi-ethnography is and why we felt it was an appropriate methodology to employ here. We'll talk about digital autobiographical identity texts, what they are, and how they can be produced. We'll cover the findings from our research, which is a set of conversations. We'll talk about the convergence and divergence in our positions and ideas on a set of emergent themes. We'll conclude with discussion of some of the affordances of this pedagogy, considering what it can contribute, what our research can contribute to the field, and what this type of pedagogy can accomplish in the language teacher education classroom, as well as for classroom teachers in K-12 classrooms, as well as post-secondary levels. So why did we engage in this work? Well, I was interested primarily in having taught a particular course called Critical Academic Literacies, where there's a lot of discussion of the intersections and the inextricable connections between language and power. And I was interested in how teacher candidates had not only felt about a particular assignment that they completed in the course, which was the creation of a particular identity-affirming text, but how they were then taking that and employing it in their own classrooms following graduation. So in this study, we discussed the affordances, the potential, and the limitations of this particular pedagogy. So over the course of this presentation, we'll share our perspectives. Not only from a teacher perspective, you'll get to know this particular tool if you decide that it may be appropriate for you to adapt it or adopt it to your particular context. And we'll also discuss the limitations and some questions that are raised that teachers and teacher educators can consider when deciding whether or not to use this particular pedagogy or how to adapt it. So OISE, again, the education faculty at the University of Toronto, has several streams of students in the graduate programs. And in particular, we're going to be talking about a course that I taught in CTL, Curriculum, Teaching and Learning, where students in the course were either in one of three streams, either Masters of Teaching, Masters of Education, or Masters of Arts. So what was this course? Well, essentially this course was set up to introduce teachers to issues that they should be considering prior to entering classrooms where they're going to encounter an increasingly linguistically and culturally diverse set of students. So the course was designed to to improve these teachers' capacity to understand the intersections between academic literacies theory, critical pedagogy, and their future and current pedagogical practices. So again, some of these teachers were actively working in school boards as they took this course. Others were taking their degree program, taking a leave of absence from teaching and taking the degree program, and still others were taking this master's program prior to entering the teaching force. So again, this course was designed to encourage educators to draw on their newfound understandings of research and theory and apply that to either their real or imagined classroom practice, particularly considering engaging with the culturally and linguistically diverse students in Ontario classrooms, but also some of these teachers plan to go abroad and teach. So it was to prepare teachers for any type of language teaching context. So again, one of the final goals was that students would have an opportunity to explore issues specific to their particular contexts, as well as engage with general debates in the field. So a quick discussion of the different positionalities, which is sort of a keystone of this type of research, is positioning ourselves before we get into discussing the predetermined themes. So there are several positionalities that we share. For example, we were all at OISE. We all shared English as a language, not necessarily our first language, but a language. And we all consider ourselves educators and instructors. And in this case, now that we've engaged in this project, researchers, although only Christina was involved in a research degree program, whereas Maria and Allison were studying in a course-based program. All of us are now engaged in research and could consider ourselves researchers after being involved in this multi-ethnographic project. The reason I bring up that divergence in research expertise is that was one of the interesting things about engaging in this work together, is that we all brought varying levels of research expertise. So in my role, I very much saw myself as a facilitator here, in allowing the conversations between these three classroom teachers who, as you can see when you look at their positionalities and experiences, have different, for example, Allison and Maria have English as an L1, as do I. Christina has Indonesian as L1. Right, so we have several shared positionalities, and the differences are our language teaching experiences and the language that we work with in the classroom. So Christina is working with English, and whereas Maria and Allison are teaching French. All three of the teacher candidates are using a language that they wouldn't consider as their first, so they would be categorized as non-native users of their language of instruction or their target language. And that will be a point that comes up time and time again in our conversations. So the lens we bring to understand our discussions and connect it to the research in the area is drawing on critical plurilingual pedagogies. So critical pedagogy and the connections between language and power, plurilingual pedagogies as a conceptual approach to language identity research that views plurilingualism as a positive and sees teachers who are drawing on their different linguistic resources, that this can be an advantage rather than a disadvantage. drawing on Academic Literacies work, which views higher education competencies as more broader than traditional literacies of reading and writing, but much more broader into critical thinking skills, oral production skills, etc., and identity affirmation at the top of this foundational diagram here. And why is identity affirmation so important here? Well, drawing on a lot on Dr. Jim Cummins' work, identity affirmation underscores the pedagogy that we've employed and we've discussed in this research. And it is, number one, something that was highlighted throughout the course that these language teacher candidates took at OISE. And it comes up time and again in our discussions of the potential of this pedagogy for these teachers as they consider their professional identities, their evolving professional identities. So in terms of methodology, so what is a multi-ethnography? Well, as opposed to an autoethnography, which is self-reflective, a multi-ethnography is research where the researchers are simultaneously both the researchers and the researched. So how we went about this, of carrying out the multi-ethnography, is there are pre-planned thematic areas of discussion, and then through conversations over time, and these conversations, for example, for us took place over Skype, over through email threads, and none in person, so that none of this happened in person. These conversations happen over time. Our time was over the course of a 6-month period in 2018. These discussions happen, the conversations happen, and then several levels of analysis take place, examining how our experiences, our positions converge and diverge, and drawing out some themes from these conversations and from this convergence and divergence, and drawing out lessons that can be learned, both for ourselves as researchers and for the broader community. And as we'll show in the next slide here, so our multi-logs, our data collection, so the data collected is then analyzed and coded. There are multiple levels of analysis and coding. The stage that we're at, in fact, in this research project right now is the rehashing these critical themes and topics. So we haven't fully completed this project, but we felt it was important to share the work at this point. Following the rehashing of critical themes and topics, the conversations are then weaved, the extant literature is weaved into the conversations and presented in a way that can lead to uptake on the part of our desired audience. So what exactly is the pedagogy that we're discussing? So again, drawing on work by Norton and Barkhuizen and Fetz and Pavlenko and Norton, we're understanding identity as how a person understands his or her relationship to the world, how the relationship is structured across time and space, and how the person understands possibilities for the future. So we're looking at imagination for these particular teacher candidates, in them imagining their future classroom practice. And it's important as a lens, identity as our lens here, because we're trying to better understand how this particular pedagogy can impact the self-perception and the construction of professional identity for these teacher candidates, as well as how they negotiate that identity across contexts. So how are we doing this? Well, we're drawing on work of Jim Cummins and Margaret Early, where they describe identity texts and suggest that these type of texts hold up a mirror to students in which their identities are reflected back in a positive light. And we argue that this is likewise the case for teacher candidates, where their written, spoken, signed, visual, music, multimodal production can then be held up in a positive light for them to view themselves as teaching professionals. So what's the autobiographical identity text, the digital version? So an AIT is a multimodal digital text created using, not exclusively, but possibly through tools such as Screencast-O-Matic or Prezi, allowing for a narrative description of one's experiences with language teaching and learning and language practices over time. So teachers consider how they use language in different contexts, and how their history of language use has impacted their construction of their own identities. They're asked to reflect upon their multiple hybrid and evolving identities as language teachers and learners and university students in a manner that provides a platform for critical reflection and the production of authentic academic language use. And as we'll describe later, engaging in this type of activity doesn't preclude the language teacher educator from having students produce university level texts. So just because there's a multimodal production of an identity text doesn't mean that there can't be more traditional forms of textual production that take place alongside the digital text. So drawing on some of my work in this area in an EAP setting, a digital text includes a description of language practices, and this activity allows us to positively reflect hybrid, multiple, evolving identities as multilingual, multi-competent users of whichever language, in this case English, while building awareness of language as a socially situated, dynamic, and meaning-making tool. So here are some steps that I suggest that teacher candidates and students go through when producing an identity text. So the first stage is one of reflection, where they brainstorm and mind map, and some ideas for this type of brainstorming stage are using a silhouette, for example, and writing words or coloring different parts of the silhouette to represent different parts of oneself. Using a mind map is also another idea, with the self in the middle and different bubbles intersecting in different ways with the self. Next, producing an outline, which will guide the producer of the text while they're narrating. Followed by multimodal production, so drawing, collaging, writing, inclusion of multimodal artifacts like pictures, voice, music, video. And then finally, as I suggested earlier, traditional text reflecting on, well, how I use it is language teacher candidates reflect on the choices they've made in producing their digital text. So why have I chosen to represent myself in this particular way? Including, importantly, I think, why have I chosen to represent myself in this particular way? And what are some challenges that I have when negotiating this particular identity in my educational context? So some of the prompt questions that I use to get teachers thinking about their professional identities, so what makes them who they are? What are their salient teaching features and characteristics? And again, this can work with teacher candidates of differing levels of teaching experience, right? So they don't have to be experienced teachers to be able to imagine what their salient features or characteristics are. But it also can work that way with experienced teachers. So what drives you to be a teacher? How do you see your role as a teacher? How has this role changed over time? What's the role of language been in your life? How do you use language similarly and differently across contexts? And not just language, but languages, registers of language. Which communities are you a part of? And this question was particularly salient for the my research partners, who you'll hear from today, the teacher candidates who suggested that there's a level of dissonance in being legitimate or seen as legitimate participants or members of particular communities, given that they're using the language that they're instructing as an additional language. So at this point, I'd like to suggest that if you're viewing this, that you download this presentation and go to these links, which play examples of these teacher candidates' digital autobiographical identity texts, as well as their sort of traditional textual reflection pieces that go along with their digital AITs. And I would say, not to take away from the importance of our work here, but just watching these texts, the construction, these texts are wonderful and creative and powerful, and show how these teachers have really engaged not just with the assignment, but really robustly in the task of critical self-reflection, and how it's not always a comfortable process, but a rewarding process in the end. So I highly encourage you to engage with these identity texts. So just some broad tips for using this particular pedagogy in your classrooms. One excellent tip is model it, do it yourself. So create your own identity text, whether you're an experienced professor emeritus or a sessional instructor. I think it can be rewarding for anybody, and it provides a nice model for students to consider when doing their own production. Some other tips are, make sure you're giving class time for students to do this, and this is one of when we discuss the affordances and the issues with this pedagogy, one thing that came up in terms of a limitation is the access, the differing levels of digital literacies amongst the teacher candidate population, which also teachers have encountered in their K-12 environments. So figuring out a way to make these production tools available and as accessible as possible to students is a must. Providing a clear evaluation rubric and objectives, providing chunks of language that can help through the narration, and making sure that there's a traditional literacy task connected to this digital production. So like I said, for our case in this course, it was a 2 to 3 page reflection piece that accompanied the digital text. But that can be decided by the teacher educator. And provide feedback at several levels, right? At the level of critical thinking, of clarity, coherence, structural, rhetorical, lexical, grammatical, etc. So on to the findings. So over the course of this findings section, we'll highlight some of the perspectives of the teacher candidates as they reflect upon the potential, the limitations, and the affordances of engaging in this work and using this particular pedagogy. So some of the themes here were divided into 2 categories. So teacher focus, so considering language teacher candidates considering their own experiences as teacher candidates, and then student focus, which is these teacher candidates considering how they have adopted and used this pedagogy in their classrooms, and some of the considerations around using them with students of different ages and cultural and linguistic backgrounds. So on the teacher side, it's considering the impact of creating these texts and the impact of engaging in this multi-ethnography. On the student side, considering the positive impact of students creating these texts and the associated positive, in most cases, results of using this pedagogy and what that does to the teacher-student relationship. In terms of limitations and challenges, so there's discussion by the teacher candidates of their challenges of wearing two hats as teacher researchers and engaging in this project. And then the limitations and challenges for incorporating this pedagogy into classrooms in school boards across Ontario and Quebec, and some of the limitations of doing so in school boards that have different resources with students with different levels of digital literacies, schools with different capabilities for allowing access to technology, etc. So what were some of the key findings? So first of all, let's focus on the impact of creating these AITs, these digital AITs. So what did these teacher candidates have to say about the experience of producing these texts? So let's listen to what they have to say. So first we'll listen to Christina.
And its written reflection were tailored for language educators like me to look inwards and to reflect on my identity, which include my cultural and linguistic knowledge, my education, and everything in between. This experience has given me the opportunity to reflect on how my identity has shaped my teaching practices. The process of creating digital AIT has allowed me to get in touch with my insecurities and struggles, and it has allowed me to approach language learning and identity negotiation in a more holistic way.
So listening to Christina, she brings up the important theme of how this can positively impact her self-perception of herself as a user and instructor of an additional language, particularly from her position as an instructor of English, given that English is an additional language for her. And now Maria.
It is the most transformative project I have ever experienced. From knowing mechanistic aspects of education, teaching, and related documents, to knowing myself and focusing on students' identities has reoriented my attitudes, beliefs, and practices in many ways. I am much more accepting, flexible, and patient with the diverse learners' language trajectories and abilities.
So again, Maria, both looking inward and outward there, talking about the potential of this pedagogy for her to reflect on herself as a teacher of French, given that she's using that as an additional language, the transformative nature of the project in how she views herself, but also how she feels she can support her students. Next, and I'll let the teachers, I'll let you reflect on what the teachers have to say rather than parroting what they have to say. I think it's important that their voices are at the forefront here.
The process of creating digital AIT has helped me to focus on the positive emotions and how my unique background and experiences can inform my understanding on the culturally and linguistically diverse students' struggles, their language learning, and identity negotiation.
I believe that all teachers are language teachers. Regardless of the subject we teach, we are all using language to convey meaning in the classroom. My role as an FSL teacher is to create an environment where my students feel safe, confident and excited to explore the French language and culture. After years of struggling with my non-native speaker identity, I have come to accept that I do not need to speak perfect French. In fact, each mistake that I make creates a teaching opportunity. My ultimate goal is to make French a living language for my students.
So again, listening to Allison, Christina, and Maria here, it's clear that this is one of the overarching themes is the potential of this pedagogy in allowing for the identity affirming nature of this pedagogy, and it allowing for these teachers to maybe not conceptualize themselves, but reconceptualize themselves as effective and competent teachers of the language, whether it be French or English, that they're teaching. So now we'll move on to their reflections on participating in this multi-ethnography. And first of all, having a community that supports and empowers the importance of this type of work, this type of identity work that we're engaged in, and then reflecting on being a teacher researcher, of wearing these multiple hats.
I feel fortunate to have been given the opportunity to collaborate with others and learn about their personal linguistic and cultural trajectories. I felt an obligation to all group members to do the best quality reflection and writing that I could. Through the coding process, I worked diligently to capture others' meaningful ideas and thoughts from our email exchanges and Skype sessions without imposing my personal views. This meant that I had to be aware of my biases in my interpretation. I was able to engage my metacognitive, interpersonal, and interpersonal skills through this research process. My tech skills continue to be developed throughout this process, and I can now be comfortable with sharing my knowledge with others. I come away from this teacher-researcher role with a better sense of my communication skills, a higher level of self-confidence, and identity that has transformed into becoming a legitimate contributor to the teaching profession, different educational and academic settings.
And now Maria.
I appreciate the opportunity to exchange knowledge, to empower and being empowered, and most importantly, to have a community of teachers that support, challenge, strengthen, and refine my understanding on the importance and challenges surrounding the topic of digital literacy, language learning, and identity.
So again, reflections on the potential of this work in having a more positive self-image, in sharing experiences with each other, in feeling that they can balance the work, as the next slide will also show, feeling that they can balance these roles as reflective teacher practitioners, but also emerging researchers.
Being a part of this digital AIT research has given me a chance to step outside of my everyday teacher life, my everyday teacher concerns, like which child forgot their homework today, or how am I going to mark all these journals by tomorrow? So much of teaching is reacting to situations moment to moment, and I like that this research project has given me the chance to reflect on the digital AIT in a more in-depth way I may not have done otherwise.
So again, I think it's really interesting, Allison's perspective there, particularly as someone who's deeply involved in the sort of day-to-day teaching and concerns that we all go through as instructors. And it speaks to the potential of engaging in research, even when one is not well-versed in research methodologies and doesn't have a long trajectory of research. I think this points to the potential of this particular approach, this conversational approach that this multi-ethnography affords in allowing teachers to reconceptualize themselves as not only classroom educators, but repositioning them as contributors to the field who have important stories to share. So going over now, considering how this work, how this pedagogy was taken up by these teacher candidates and employed in their classrooms. So how It's important learning about multiple perspectives, how the digital text production can lead to academic language and broader academic literacies developments among their K-12 student populations, and developing digital literacy skills.
Digital AITs can be seen as a social justice response to inequitable relations of power within the ed system. Compassion, mindfulness, and meaningful learning experiences are central to digital AIT processes.
So it's important from Maria's perspective to connect these digital texts to students' lived experiences, and from her perspective, this textual production allows them to do that, and as you'll see further, not only allows them to discuss language and as a tool for constructing and understanding the world around them, but allows for the development of particularly meaningful language production and relationships between teachers and students.
Through the digital AIT, the teacher reflects on experiences that have shaped her identity as an academically literate person and harnesses that power to mobilize each student's cultural and linguistic capital, identity components, interests, voices, and outside of school knowledges to encourage students' movement toward the same powerful identity.
So again, discussion of engaging in language use, but languages use, languaging, that helps students, helps better reflect their evolving and hybrid identities and language practices. So now the teacher candidates are going to discuss how the multi-literacies are engaged and developed through use of this particular pedagogy.
The teacher provides diverse genres and forms of text and draws explicit attention to the specific codes and conventions as scaffolding students' critical reading and written production. Multiple perspectives are privileged and open to interpretation and negotiation of meaning. Connecting text to students' lives, making comparisons across other texts, and how they fit into the wider world enables space for critical reflection of oneself in the wider world.
And Christina.
The digital AIT could be a good platform for students to learn about time management, data organization, writing, editing, presenting, and also for them to understand how to create media text for different purposes and audiences, for them to experiment with different forms of writing conventions, narration, computer software. It is also an opportunity for them to learn how to convey different meanings and using different type of texts and strategies, and for them to understand and be critical on how to execute it successfully.
So again, and importantly, I think both of these teacher candidates are highlighting that this is not just pie-in-the-sky pedagogy, that this is meaningful use of language, meaningful linguistic production that can help students understand not just how to complete this particular assignment, but how to engage and draw upon their linguistic resources when producing different types of genres for different audiences. So now discussing potential for relationship building.
This assignment allowed me to reflect on my hybrid identity as both a language teacher and a language learner. This exercise brought back difficult memories of feeling like an outsider while learning a new language and trying to gain access to certain communities. These experiences can help me as a teacher to empathize with my own culturally and linguistically diverse students who may be experiencing similar challenges, and motivates me to try to get to know them better. Being a language teacher can mean being in a position of power over your students. The digital AIT assignment reminds us that language shapes all of our identities, and I believe that this could help build tolerance and acceptance within a community of learners.
So again, Allison looking in two directions, right? Considering her own professional development and the ability for this pedagogy to allow her to better understand herself and better position her to attend to the needs of her students, and also considering the students' language development and the potential of the pedagogy in allowing for the teacher to best support that broad language development and critical thinking.
Some of the benefits include a counteraction to assumptions about students, taking for granted the powerful impact that a teacher's experiences have had on her and her future students, questioning the power we hold over a student's critical academic trajectory, and transforming pedagogical practices where student identity and knowledge creation become central to the CFP. The curriculum expectations can be achieved, but with a different focus. The digital AIT demands student autonomy, authorship, and knowledge creation, which can better inform the entire CFP.
So again, identity affirming and providing the potential for deeper, more meaningful relationships between students and instructors, and allowing for students to see themselves as legitimate members of multiple communities, including the one that they're engaged in learning. And it helps counteract a sort of deficit approach of seeing these students as incomplete or poor users of this additional language, and helps them to imagine themselves as competent and meaningful producers of the language. And not only the target language, but multiple languages.
All language teachers and learners should engage in such a process of critical reflection so that they can perform identity-affirming activities with their students. Language teachers can track their language learning developmental experiences with tensions and privileges so that an acceptance and vision of students' positive identity formation can continue in their presence.
Right. So again, and Maria suggests that this is a potentially bonding experience that develops a strong classroom community. And I found the same thing in my work that these teacher candidates could attest to. Is it forms stronger than expected, in my case, stronger than expected bonds between participants in a course in this community.
I often take inspiration from my own children, wondering how I would want them to be taught at school. Mostly, I just want their teacher to see them for who they are, such amazingly complex beings, and how much they could contribute to any classroom community. I believe the digital AIT is a great tool for teachers to explore students' language identities and connect with each other on a deeper level.
So again, just speaking to the affordances here, right, for creating the conditions for these students to engage more meaningfully with each other, for developing peer-to-peer relationships, and again, as the teachers have suggested, for developing stronger teacher-student relationships. All right, now on to some of the limitations and challenges of using this pedagogy, of employing it in diverse contexts, as well as the limitations and challenges of engaging in this teacher-researcher activity. And one of the overarching themes that comes up time and again is the issue of vulnerability, both for the potentially for the students producing these texts, as well as for teacher candidates.
I can picture myself actually sharing my own AIT as an example for my students, and I think that by putting ourselves out there in such an open and real way, our students will feel inspired to do the same. This openness and vulnerability, I think, taps into important emotions tied to language and identity that can create important bonds between students and with the teacher.
So Allison suggesting the potential, but that this is also a big leap to put themselves out there. So in engaging in this work as teachers and teacher candidates, we can imagine how intense an experience it can be for students to put themselves out there, especially for students that have these culturally and linguistically diverse students who have often been positioned as deficient. For them to produce a text and share their work with others can often be a daunting task.
This project presented an uncomfortable opportunity to revisit, re-examine, and reconcile the conflicts associated with my linguistic and cultural identities from childhood to adulthood. My linguistic and cultural capital was not always perceived as such by others. My perception was that Italianness was not something to be proud of in educational and social contexts, aside from home and family-based events. Feelings of wanting to be accepted for who I am multidimensionally by all others, wherever and whenever I was present, was not a part of my lived experiences in general. Central to my identity as a teacher is one who desires a feeling of belonging for all students to experience. This is why this project was transformational for me. I finally realized what my drive was to be an educator initially, and I was able to articulate it through this project for the first time. I realized that I had to go through this revisiting of moments I wanted to leave in the past to clearly know where I am headed in my professional identity development.
Right, so as Maria reflects there, this produced a sense of vulnerability that she felt ultimately was worthwhile. But it doesn't mean that this is not, I guess importantly, it's important for the teacher educator to reflect on the experience of these teacher candidates. And from my perspective, it just brings up again the importance of modeling, which Allison will now speak to, as well as laying the foundation for this textual production, whether laying that foundation includes how you model particular practices that take a plurilingual approach, plurilingual pedagogical approach, and making students comfortable and feel comfortable with sharing different parts of themselves, including the different languages that they engage in and produce.
Creating a digital AIT for my peers at the university level was exciting, but also slightly intimidating. I was worried about putting so much of my private life on Prezi, which is an open platform. I was also unsure of how much of my private versus professional life to share, as I felt like my family has such a large role in shaping my language identity. In the end, I was glad to have opened up as much as I did and felt more connected to my classmates.
So as other research, past research looking at identity texts has highlighted, there's oftentimes a positive experience by not just the student themselves, but also their family and their support networks that they share the text with. However, there's also a danger here that there's extreme vulnerability that can be sensed by the producers of these texts, meaning that whoever's engaging in the support and the scaffolding has to attend in a very considerate way to the needs and the concerns of the teacher candidates and the students. Finally, on the topic of vulnerability, the teacher candidates reflect on how it felt to not bring a lot of research experience into a research project and still be an active member of the research team.
I just recently presented my digital AIT in a large group classroom format to approximately 50 teacher candidates whom I had just met an hour before the presentation. This presented a risky venture for me, not knowing anything about the very identities before me. I took some comfort in my belief that digital AIT production is innovative, identity-affirming work that deserves a larger space in educational settings. I also knew that I did not want to present traditional texts where others are the authors rather than the students themselves. So the risk was worth the reward in benefiting the next generation of students, teachers. Feedback included appreciation, ability to resonate with my experiences, and questions about how to deal with childhood trauma and trauma related to language learning, as they contemplated and anticipated their own future students' potential digital AIT production and subsequent showcasing to their classroom peers. As teachers, we recognize the diverse and broad lived experiences of our students and can take every precaution necessary to avoid exclusionary practices and prepare everyone for uncomfortable yet strategic activity design.
So again, this is one of the areas of divergence in terms of our positions, where we had different feelings and experiences with sharing this work. But Maria's describing there how she's taken this pedagogy and engaged in her role as a teacher educator, working with teachers, not only working with her students, but she's wearing multiple hats, working with a post-secondary crowd as well. And that the feedback that she received was varied, and that highlighted the need for preparing robustly for engaging with this pedagogy, but that there is a risk and reward involved in employing this type of pedagogy in any classroom, including with adults.
Some of my favorite course readings and research papers have been the ones which include teacher voices. I think that it is important for teachers to honestly share their classroom struggles, but also pedagogical tools that worked with real kids. I'm very confident in promoting the digital AIT with my fellow educators.
So again, Allison, with suggesting, and something that I would agree with, and I hope that we're accomplishing here in this presentation, is forefronting teacher voices and highlighting the importance of sharing their perspectives and learning from the perspectives and the experiences of teachers across different language teaching contexts. So again, some limitations and challenges, and this time around access. So given diverse levels of digital literacy across contexts, creating a digital AIT can be intimidating, particularly for teachers who fear or are feeling reluctant to engage with these new technologies and employ this type of pedagogy with their students. That's why, from my perspective as the teacher educator, it's really important to attend to all of the different steps of textual production and to scaffold this overall production through giving students class time to go through the brainstorming, the consideration of the multimodal elements that they'll include in their text, and to critically reflect in a robust way over time, not just in one sit down, but over time, about the different intersectional features, that their characteristics that combine to form their identity. Overall, and this was we had different perspectives on this, but the teachers engaged in this study felt that their level of digital competencies improved, and that with the proper scaffolding and access to digital tools that they were provided in our course, that they felt they were able to produce their texts in a meaningful way and increase their digital literacy competencies over the course, to the point where they feel comfortable in allowing their students and engaging in this pedagogy in their own classrooms. However, as was raised in our discussions, access is uneven across school boards and communities.
In inner city schools, such as where I used to spend my time at, technology or digital resources such as iPads can be limited, and students have no choice but to share them. Many of the students also did not have any access to technology or internet connection at home, which would make digital AIT as a school-based activity only.
So certainly something to consider for teacher educators and teachers working in contexts where there's less access to these digital tools and to these technologies is how much class time are we going to give, and what type of access can we provide for students. And from my perspective, I would suggest there's a continuum of, depending on the digital literacies levels of students, of teacher candidates. Some populations will need extensive scaffolding in class and time to engage with this production in class, and others won't. They'll run with it and produce for example, some of the wonderful AITs that these teacher candidates produced. Again, I would strongly suggest that including that you go back, download this presentation, and click on their digital AITs. We've shared this in our Google Drive space, so perhaps you'll engage. I strongly encourage you to engage with these teachers' identity texts. And ultimately, I think bringing up the issue of access is important as a consideration, and something that can't necessarily be overcome with good intentions. So there are ways to adopt and to adapt this particular pedagogy to make it so that this textual production can happen in class rather than at home, to take away the need for this access at home. And I look forward to hearing from more teachers as this pedagogy is more widely employed as to how they've adapted it to different contexts. But again, this is one of the issues that came up repeatedly, and that we had different perspectives on, was the need to provide access to our students at the moment of producing these texts, and how much we can expect, what the levels of digital literacies we can expect among our students, ability of teachers to provide effective scaffolding, etc. So now the issue of time. So because I'm trying to keep this to an hour or close to an hour, I will briefly go over the different perspectives from the teachers. So given their busy lives, time was a big challenge in conducting this study, because we're all instructors, we all have courses that we're teaching, busy lives, balancing different. I'll play one of the perspectives for you here.
Two main challenges of this research were lack of time and practical experience. I would have loved to spend more time reading articles on the subject of language and identity to deepen my understanding of the topic. I also haven't had the opportunity yet to actually put the digital AIT into action, so I have less to contribute in that sense. I also think that we would have gotten more out of this research if we could have physically met a few times to discuss, but distance in this case was an issue.
So again, bringing up some of the limitations of engaging in this type of work by distance, in finding time to robustly engage with not just robustly engage with the research production, the data collection and analysis, but also to compare it to the extant literature in the field, which is where I see my role as the next step for us, is weaving these conversations together and putting them in the form of an article to share with the broader community. So how did our positions converge and diverge? So there was widespread agreement on the potential of using this pedagogy as an identity-affirming tool, both for teacher candidates and with students, and in particular for those labeled non-native users of the target language, in our case English and French, in these Canadian contexts. But I would say that it's certainly not limited to those who are labeled non-native users of a target language. I'd say this is important as well for any teacher candidate in developing an appreciation for their students and thus a better ability to develop their professional identity, but more importantly, attend to the needs of their students, their culturally and linguistically diverse students. We agreed that there's a big leap necessary here in sharing this sensitive identity work with different audiences. There was widespread agreement of the need to develop particular strategies for scaffolding. And we all agreed, and I thought this was particularly heartening and important, of the accessibility of this type of research design for teachers who have little research experience. So we disagreed on, at times, how to adopt and adapt this pedagogy in our different classroom contexts. And as we just mentioned, the accessibility, given the diverse levels of digital literacies and access to digital tools across school boards and classrooms. So again, suggesting the affordances of this pedagogy, allowing for students to share their a deeper and broader range of themselves, right? So this is reflecting. I hear this from teacher candidates all the time about how they've used this with their students, and their students feel that it's so rewarding because it's a much bigger and better and bolder and broader picture of themselves than simply engaging with the traditional production of a more standard text. In this case, it allows students to become authors of these meaningful texts, to refine their digital technologies and their broader academic literacy skills, to craft and hone their message for different audiences, and to engage in learning that's active and engaging and motivational. So here are some questions for those who are engaging and considering adopting and adapting this pedagogy for their particular context, right? So for language teacher educators, some questions that arise are how can we promote traditional literacies which students are interested in? And I think we have an ethical responsibility to provide the sort of more traditional literacy skills to our students and our teacher candidates. So how can we promote those traditional literacy skills alongside the digital ones promoted in such an assignment? How can we reduce the digital anxieties among our teacher candidates, some of which you heard today in the reflections of these teacher candidates? How do you assess these candidates' digital AITs? And how would you address the issue of vulnerability in creating and sharing these AITs? So for example, students in my course only shared it with me unless they gave me explicit permission to share it with the rest of the class. Now, I've heard of others engaging in this pedagogy and having students agree to share it from the get-go with their peers and having peer feedback. And I think that's interesting, but again, it raises the issue of vulnerability, and maybe highlights the importance of creating a tight-knit community of teacher candidates or students. And in K-12 classrooms, right? So how can teachers employ this pedagogy in a differentiated way, depending on the needs of their students? How can they effectively scaffold the objectives? How can they assess students' AITs, which I think is a question across contexts? And then how can they address vulnerability in students of differing age groups? So we'll leave you with what we feel are some of the contributions of this pedagogy and this methodology that we employed. So in terms of pedagogy, we think this can be innovative and effective both for language teacher educators and language teachers, particularly effective as an identity affirming tool not just for those using a language as an additional one, but for all teachers. It affords the development of critical multi and digital literacies alongside traditional ones, and it affords equitable identity affirming support for culturally and linguistically diverse students. On the methodology side, I think our findings suggest the potential of these multi-ethnographies as a type of action research for teacher researchers, right, where they're reflecting on the impact of the pedagogy and how they can adopt it for their particular contexts, and while they're engaged in data analysis. And it could be adapted to meet the needs of particular teacher researcher communities, right? Depending on the research background, it is suggested that when engaging with this type of work, that there is some sort of facilitator from a more senior scholar, a role that I took on in this particular project. And methodologically, it affords a particular lens with which or through which to view teachers' lives, right? Both in terms of their professional development and their teaching practices, highlighting the importance of teachers sharing stories with other teachers. And here's just a set of selected references, and we look forward to sharing our work over the course of the L2DL conference and beyond. And we're eager to respond to the questions from the audience over the course of this week. And we're also happy to answer any questions if you'd like to contact us directly through our email. So thank you for your attention, and we hope that you found this presentation interesting, engaging, and we look forward to hearing how you take up this pedagogy in your classrooms. Thank you on behalf of our research team.